Um, Good morning, everyone, and congratulations for actually finding this room, because we struggled. I'm really happy to welcome you all today to our session looking at anticipatory action and the need to distinguish between simple and what we're calling wicked crises when deciding how best to use it. So anticipatory action, taking action before a crisis develops, has been used with some significant success in places like floods in Bangladesh or drought and harsh winters in Mongolia. But we're looking at when it's used in larger, complex contexts like Somalia, where the crisis is of unknown duration, the causes are multiple and complex, and the solution is not particularly clear. So in these kinds of settings, is it just a question of scaling up and expanding reach? Or does there need to come with a slightly more careful engagement with the specific challenges of what we might call these more wicked crises? Here to discuss the question, I'm really happy to welcome Nimo Hassan, the director of the Somali NGO Consortium, Edward Parkinson, the advisor for crisis anticipation and risk monitoring at the START Network, along with Simon Levine and Zainab Mwalin, who are researchers from the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. We'd like this session to be as interactive as possible. So we're here to explore a problem, not to tell you what to think about it. So when it comes time to open our conversation to the floor, both questions and reflections are very welcome. So that usual thing of one comment and two reflections is actually encouraged rather than scorned. If you're listening online, please raise your hand. We're going to try and make sure you can speak to the room. If that doesn't work out, just put your question in the chat and we'll make sure that that's included. For those online, closed captions are available. Please access these by clicking on the button at the bottom of your screen. And just a reminder that this event is being recorded. The video will be available on the event webpage in a couple of days' time. And you can listen back on the discussion through the ODI event podcast channel. Just to kick us off, we can see from the very packed schedule at HNPW that anticipatory action is very much something that is on the agenda and is something that people are interested in and excited about. So I'm just wanted to ask one of us to sort of talk about where it came from and where we are now. So I'll just turn over to Simon to start and apologize for the microphone acrobatics here.
Yeah, thanks. Hopefully everyone can hear on online. Thanks, Ollie. Yeah, it is. I mean, it's really nice to see. You know, it's a whole topic here. A few years ago, it was very niche, and now it's becoming mainstream. It reminds me a little bit about cash, in some ways, good and bad. Anticipatory action, like cash, thousands and thousands of years old. The first recorded instance being probably in the Bible, in the story of Joseph, when he had advance warning of a 7-year famine. So he set up a strategic grain reserve in Egypt. That's the principle. It really is as obvious as that. Like cash, well tested, like cash, it's what everybody normally does in their own lives. And it's super common sense. And it seems to, to kind of bypass the whole aid bureaucracy way of doing things, cut straight to the chase, think ahead, see what's coming. But then it kind of didn't really go anywhere in the aid world or wasn't really used. Until, I don't know, I suppose the last decade, and that probably came on the back of years and years and years of the same critique being leveled, largely at slow onset famines, slow onset crises and droughts and so on. The response always being months and months late, everyone knowing it was late, everyone really knowing why. And the focus then had probably been put on the delays caused by things like funding mechanisms. We can't release the money until we see the children are starving and the malnutrition rates go up, and by the time you release the money and then get action, more months pass, and then you're too late. So the idea then is, fine, we have to set up a separate mechanism to bypass that, if you like, to get the commitment in advance that we're going to do this, and then here we go. And it's steadily grown. I mean, you gave a couple of examples of countries where it's worked really well. Impact assessment shown it does work. Proof of concept has been established quite nicely now, and hey, suddenly it's mainstream. Everyone's talking about it, and just like cash, this is the new silver bullet that's going to solve the problems of the world, because those are the kind of things we love in the aid world.
Okay. So I could turn over to Ed, maybe give us just a rough idea of kind of how the construction of this silver bullet is going at the moment.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, well, the institutionalization of anticipatory action, there's a fair amount to talk about. IFRC DREF, OCHA SURF, Start Network, Start Fund, Start Ready, FAO, WFP, they all have anticipatory action programs. Increasingly, we're seeing anticipatory action mainstreamed through NGO strategies. We're seeing more and more roles that are anticipatory action, even anticipatory action teams. And also there's local agencies that are doing anticipatory action projects as well. So there's a fair amount of examples and people getting interested, excited. There's the G7 declaration around scaling up and growing anticipatory action. It's clearly something that's high on the agenda of quite a few important organizations. But despite this, there was an assessment or a report that ODI and Start Network had from last year, which looked at kind of the state of and potential for anticipatory action and risk financing. And while there was an assessment of the last 8 years of crises from SURF and Start funds, over 50% of those crises had somewhat element of predictability to them, with 20% of them being highly predictable. We're still only talking about less than 1% of humanitarian financing being anticipatory action. So while there's a lot of talk, and it's clearly a hot topic, as you say, it's all over the agenda this week. In terms of action and funding, it's still quite limited, and it's not something we've seen scaled yet.
So I guess thinking in terms of scale, one of the other things that is on everyone's mind this week, probably as much, if not more so than anticipatory action, is the ongoing crisis in the Horn. Nemo, do you want to tell us a bit about exactly what is going on there and kind of how that might relate to AA being useful?
Good morning. Thank you very much. The situation in the Horn of Africa it's extremely dire. And I think a lot of people in the room and definitely online are very much aware of what's going on. It's been slow onset. It's particularly if we focus on Somalia, we've had communities who've not had a chance to recover. It's been one drought after the other. You've had COVID that had a huge impact on even the local markets and the local economy. You have the desert locust that kind of basically demolished for whatever little farmers could grow. And then you had this unprecedented drought for the last 2 years or even more, where a lot of people have lost their livelihoods. And that's a context of a country which is very vulnerable. And as I said, you've had famine that has affected the majority of the communities in Somalia, particularly in southern Somalia. Like as I said, have not had the chance to recover from the multiple shocks. And then you've got the conflict that's ongoing. On top of that, we are seeing the climate-related shocks, which are exacerbating the situation, but also the frequency of these onset and build-up of crisis is actually far more recurrent than it has been historically in the Horn of Africa. So you've got a weak governance institutions in some places. I mean, it's different. The effect and impact of the drought or the floods, flash floods right now, have actually killed, led to people losing their lives, not only just their livelihoods. So it's a situation which is multi-dimensional, multi-complex, with, like I said, with not having enough time to recover before the next shock hits. Having said that, there should be a lot of data available for us to be able to use anticipatory action to try and mitigate the impact of these recurrent shocks as well. But because of the complexity and it's been very difficult to be able to do that for so long. And I look forward to the remaining discussion and see how we can maybe try and figure out. Thank you.
Zainab, I know you've done some work on how anticipatory action was used in the most recent trial in Somalia. How did that go?
So I think that currently there's sort of discourse about how we've averted famine in Horn of Africa, but I think that there are studies coming out that show that there were an estimate of over 40,000 excess deaths, which clearly shows that there were some limitations. And as part of research that I did with ALMA last year, I conducted a series of interviews with local actors working on the ground within Somalia. And as part of that research, I tried to understand both the landscape, but also tried to find where the bottlenecks were in the response. And obviously, I was doing my research towards the end of last year, but I do believe that some of those lessons can be applied to the anticipatory action framework. And I think in order to understand that, I'm going to rewind the clock just a little bit to, I think, 2020, where there were, a series of anticipatory responses by OCHA. So I think you had in July 2020, there was about 15 million US dollars that were disbursed by OCHA, even though the trigger for that was met in May 2020. So there was a lag between the trigger being met and also the funds being disbursed. And then you had the subsequent year, in April 2021, the Somali government announced a drought or declared a drought. And then in that same month, you had OCHA releasing about 20 million US dollars. And so clearly there were, anticipatory responses to the drought. But I think that for a lot of people, the question is, did we act fast enough? And I do believe that timeliness is part of the answer. And I do believe that, but I don't think that it captures the full extent of what happened in the Horn of Africa in the last few years with regards to this drought. And I say that because as part of a lot of the interviews that I did with local actors, which was towards the end of 2022, a lot of them still have not received funding for the response itself, let alone anticipatory funding. And this is because obviously with SURF funding, the principal recipients of that are UN agencies who then take quite some time to then be able to pass that funds on to local actors. And this is obviously supported by various studies. I think there was a study by the Center for Disaster Protection, which did a lessons paper on OCHA's 2020 anticipatory response. And I think Oxfam last year, along with Save the Children, published the Dangerous Delay report, in which they said that the 2020 anticipatory response was not, by the time we got to 2021, anticipatory action was not possible. And in fact, we had reached the early action phase. So I do believe that timeliness is part of the answer. And I do believe that, however, the funding that reaches, so the funding did reach UN agencies, but it took not far too long, but not enough time for it to reach local actors. And another thing that came out in my research was also the element of food bias when it comes to food security interventions. And I think that that's something that obviously is an issue when it comes to general food interventions across the humanitarian sector. I don't think it's specific to anticipatory responses, but I do believe that the current early warning systems, they do disproportionately focus on food security elements such as markets, access to food consumption. And that then tends to sideline or downplay the importance of other sectors, including nutrition, health, and inclusion, etc. So I do, as you all know, disease, not malnutrition, is the main killer during drought. So I do believe that the picture is a bit more complicated than just acting and in a timely manner. And so yeah, I think it's a bit more complicated than that.
Thanks, Zainab. Simon, I know you've also written recently on this. And can you speak a bit more maybe to the struggle of sort of doing this at scale?
Yeah, I will do. I mean, Zainab's touched on some of the bureaucratic difficulties of getting the timing right. Our research was suggesting that actually there's some other much more fundamental problems as well. So this was research, we give a quick plug to the Spark research program that we were conducting actually over a couple of years. as Nima was describing, the crisis took a long time to develop, and it was forecast because on the back of locusts, on the back of COVID, and so on, we knew that it was a La Nina event, and which tends to lead to drought, and we could see this coming again and again and again. So we said, well, if we know that there's going to be a high likelihood of a food crisis, the best way to learn about anticipatory reaction is to follow people through it, so that hopefully we'd be able to understand better ways of intervening, more sophisticated. How could we get a bit cleverer, a little bit more nuanced, and so on? So that was the idea. So I should stress, we were not looking at anticipatory reaction projects. None of the people we followed, a 100 or so households over a couple of years, none of them were beneficiaries of anticipatory action projects. So we were looking at it from the point of view of people's livelihoods. And the results really did surprise me. I mean, you heard at the beginning, I was very, and have been a great enthusiast for anticipatory reaction for over a decade. And I wasn't expecting to find the conclusions that we found. And what we really found was four big challenges for using anticipatory reaction to really make a big difference in crises like Somalia. I should stress, when we say anticipatory reaction, I'm now using it not in the sense I'd like to think about it, but in the more accepted aid sense, which is a particular humanitarian category of funding. So that, if I say anticipatory reaction, I'm kind of using the jargon rather than not normal English, if you like. The big assumption behind anticipatory reaction is, if we can that there are things that people could do if we could just unblock the possibilities. So, for example, if people were to receive some cash, they could then do something with that would help them to avoid at least some of the impacts of a crisis, because they could do something earlier. And when we're looking and analyzing people's decision-making around their livelihoods over the couple of years in which the drought intensified, on top of the floods, on top of the locusts, on top of COVID, it was very, very difficult to see that there was anything at all that people could do differently. And it was very difficult to see anything that we could unblock. So, for example, even with hindsight, we've sat down with many people, we had round tables, we've got experts together and said, tell us, with hindsight, there's the money. Yeah, what strategic choice could you do that would really make a difference in people's lives? It's almost impossible to find anything at all. Really, the only one for livestock keepers, you could say, if only you'd sold your animals a bit earlier, before, But there were good reasons why they didn't. One of which was that the price was very, very low, partly because of COVID and the Hajj and being cancelled those years. But the second reason, so the first problem, I said there were four problems. The first one being this core assumption that something useful that we could do doesn't seem to apply. The second one is, yeah, people are making their own decisions and people are being incredibly adaptive. And people are being very anticipatory about like the flood element and the locust element. When it comes to the drought, they're not taking actions, partly because they don't know the drought's coming. Even though I'm sitting in London and I know that the forecast is high likelihood of below average rains, people are going, yeah, well, I'm just waiting for the rains because they're going to be good this year. And it's no good us saying, well, if we give people money, they could take a certain kind of action. People do what they want. Yeah, people, quite rightly, people make their own decisions because they know best. They know best if they've got the right information. So this element of uncertainty is always there. I think a third reason is scale. The scale of the crisis. Anticipatory reaction, I mean, as you were saying, it's 1% of humanitarian funds. Let's say it doubles to 2%. Let's say it goes up to 5%. Yeah, we're still looking at a few tens of millions for a crisis like Somalia. If you want to tackle that kind of a crisis, you need hundreds of millions. Yeah, you need billions. So the scale and anticipatory reaction is always going to be competing with existing crises. So to say, please can I have money because I think there's going to be a problem, when someone else is working in Yemen or Nigeria or whatever and saying, never mind that I think it will, what about now? So I think we're never going to be able to get to that kind of a scale. And the last point is the organization, the way in which we've organized anticipatory reaction. It's never going to work. It's based upon having a solution. It's generic. Yeah, we have one trigger for everything that goes on. I mean, Zainab, you were talking about the food bias being built into anticipatory reaction. One of the problems is because the triggers is linked to the food security situation, and it doesn't matter what you're doing. You're all on the same trigger. So we have this centralized decision making. We have it's all sitting in its own box. It's very, very inflexible. So it's very hard to see how those kind of mechanisms are then going to be able to make a difference. So on.
Scale coming together with complexity and if that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, so we talk about a wiki crisis in the paper and indeed in this session. We borrow the term. I mean, there's a whole class of problems which have been called wicked problems. I mean, that's a term from I think about 20 years ago. And it just seemed to us that the comparisons between the complexity of these kind of crises and wicked problems was really very, very strong. I mean, if we contrast it with where anticipatory actions work very, very well, the floods, the really harsh winters in Mongolia, we've got some great success stories. What we can see there is a very, very clearly identifiable technical solution to a problem that can be rolled out at scale. It doesn't need judgment. It doesn't need to be nuanced too much about the context. We know what the problem is. It's a short-term crisis. These are people who live, if you like, in normality. There is a crisis and then they go back to normality. And we know roughly how long that period is going to be. And it's not really that long. And as I say, there's a technical solution to get them over it. None of that applies in situations like Somalia, where you've got, I mean, when did the crisis begin? I don't know, decades ago, really. People are living in permanent crises that continually evolves. When you set out and you think, oh, there is a drought coming. I mean, we had planned to finish our research well over a year ago. At the, in recovery stage, the drought's still carrying on, and and so on. So you don't know how long something is going to be. There are no technical solutions. There isn't even a clear definition of what the problem is, because everyone will have a different view. And we have to accept the fact also that the solution is part of the problem, that we're dealing with aid economies and conflict economies, where the whole landscape of politics, of decision-making, of business, everything has been skewed by aid, which may be necessary, but when you're a part of the problem, as well as trying to be a solution, you need a level of, the contextual complexity is so great. So yeah, wicked crises.
It strikes me that what you're referring to actually involves quite a substantial chunk of sort of big humanitarian responses going on at the moment. So I just wanted to turn to Ed as a pooled fund manager in a world not dominated, but where wicked problems are quite common. How is START trying to approach anticipatory action, to try and address some of this?
Thanks. I think the first thing to say is, be realistic about anticipatory action. So I don't think anyone's going to tell you that anticipatory action is a replacement for genuine vulnerability reduction and strong disaster risk management. But that said, the START network, we take an approach of flexibility, really. So ideally having flexible financing mechanisms. At START, we have our START Ready, we have our START funds, which we think, present something of a kind of coherent, complementary anticipatory action options across different scales, geographies, hazard types. So what do we mean by that? Well, START Ready is a more traditional, like trigger-based anticipatory action approach, whereas, START funds, you can really raise an alert there based on a dynamic assessment of the risk in any country, which can be not just any single trigger, any single indicator. It can also account for significant elements of vulnerability and complexity. And those decisions aren't necessarily based on, or they're not going to be based on certain thresholds being met and being automated, but they're going to be based on expert decision makers from the START network membership, humanitarians who understand their context and are able to allocate funds based on that assessment. So yeah, emphasizing the flexibility in the mechanisms to be able to manage that uncertainty that comes with the complexity. But I think it is worth saying in general, the humanitarian funds aren't enough. We don't want to be, as anticipatory action, taking money from people who need it right now. That's never going to be a good approach that people want to promote. You want to be, responding to the needs now, but also thinking about that next crisis at the same time. We also talk about flexibility in terms of the programming. So while the anticipatory action projects at start will have set activities, geographies, targeted communities, etc. And hopefully they'll be working to a plan that's been arranged in advance and is working in an anticipatory way. There is an understanding that there's going to be these uncertainties that come up, these complexities that might be changing what you need to do, and I think it's around what START do, which is facilitate a certain amount of flexibility for the implementing agencies and their local partners to be able to adapt as they see appropriate, to be able to anticipate emerging things within that. So yeah, again, emphasizing the flexibility there. And there's also kind of a great amount of uncertainty that comes with wicked problems for actually being able to do the anticipating the understanding of what's going to happen. So I think there we emphasize this approach that's common in the anticipatory action world, and we talk about a lot, which is impact-based forecasting. So moving away from anticipatory action, which might be focused on just looking at what the weather is and focusing more on what the weather will do, and properly integrating assessments of vulnerability into your triggers. So you're not just triggering based on a single thing, you're triggering based on what the impact is actually going to be for affected populations. And yeah, similarly within that, building in fail-safes. So our Start Ready system, we have what we call our basis risk options. So basis risk being a term that comes from insurance, essentially talking about if the model, if the risk analytics is not matching what the reality of the situation is, or what, for example, the other forecasts are saying, then our Start Network members can submit a basis risk request. They can say, look, the model's not accounting for this factor, this indicator, or it's faulty in some other way, and they can request the funds based on that, and that can go through a process where decisions are made by the governance committee of the Start Ready. So there are options there, and it's about building in contingencies for these wicked problems. And yeah, I guess I would say, just to finish, what do we aspire for as well? What's not right now, but what's the future? I think this week I've heard quite a few anticipatory action practitioners talk about the importance of having a joined up strategic approach around anticipatory action across the nexus. So having common programming matrix, having financial analysis across actors, across development, anticipatory action, response, so that is able to be mapped, and we can have the opportunity to take advantage of the different windows of opportunity for the different and the most appropriate intervention types at the time.
Okay, so it's a toolbox of different approaches to try and make. It's going to have to do. So it's a toolbox of different approaches to kind of try and make it more flexible and adaptive to the specific context. And I guess you did mention the fact that it's also kind of one tool in a wider toolbox, and this needs to be seen from the perspective of the nexus. Again, Zainab, I know you've done some thinking on kind of the extent to which there are overlaps there. What are the implications of thinking about anticipatory action as a nexus issue?
I think we need to think about anticipatory action as a nexus issue for several reasons, but I think the main one is the fact that there's an inherent tension between the current humanitarian model as we know it and anticipatory action as a concept. And the reason why I say that is because the humanitarian model is premised on this idea that it's needs-based, so we react on the basis of need. That is very difficult to do when you're doing anticipatory work, where you sometimes cannot always predict needs. And so I think that the allocation on the basis of need, there is a tension with that with anticipatory framework. And so I do believe that we need to get rid of the siloed approach in which you either say that anticipatory action is in the remit of humanitarian work or it's in the remit of development work. And I do believe that we can integrate and embed anticipatory action into existing formal structures within the government, within resilience programming, within development programming, as well as humanitarian programming. And we can also develop better links with informal and community-led systems, and also avoid creating new funding streams and new structures, and actually utilize the existing structures and work across the various sectors I guess in a nexus way.
Sure. Nima, did you want to pick up on some of the specifics in Somalia and how that?
Yeah, I think it's we the dreaded nexus word. I think we're looking at it as if we're already doing the nexus. It's a lot more theoretical concept rather than a programmatic approach and implementation on the ground. So if we look at Somalia, there are a couple of areas that may be durable solutions, and the nexus is slightly better, maybe water management. There are structures in place in terms of coordinating across the various sectors, even within the government as well. But a lot of it, it's like I said, it's very theoretical. It's missing a lot of aspects as well. You have to bring in the localization agenda as well. It depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to a local partner, they will tell you localization is actually, it's a word, it's a buzzword that's used in meetings. It doesn't actually materialize in accessing the funding at the right time. We talk about how it's important for us to empower, enable our national partners to be able to deliver and respond to crisis, because they're actually part and parcel of the communities they're supporting. So there's a lot of theory, but not necessarily things are happening in a more scale up and systematic way of addressing issues particularly in Somalia. And also looking at the Somalia as a whole, it's a humanitarian basket case, and it has been for the last 30 years. So the bulk of funding, however small and limited it is, goes to humanitarian rather than the broader development. And if you look at development, it's actually maybe governance, it's actually maybe security. This is where the money is going in, and not necessarily community development. So there is a disparity between what is needed to try and support and address and ensure that communities are better able to withstand these recurrent shocks, is investing in the right places at the right time. So I think what you talked about, saying time being an issue, it's a key. It's knowing when and where, and then how to address it and ensure that you are supporting community-led and having the affected communities actually at the center of any response that you want to do. And then now you have climate induced crises which are exacerbating the situation. Now, does Somalia access any climate financing? The answer is no, because of how the systems are defined and how FIIs are actually categorizing and why is Somalia not being able to access, or because it has weak government institutions. So you need to be able to resolve that before you can do that. But the crises don't wait, and people are dying. So anticipatory action is difficult to implement in these type of protracted crises where people have lived in ITP centers for over 30 years. It's second generation of families that are living in this recurrent crisis. And then we're putting a Band-Aid on issues rather than building the resilience of the community, rather than, and purely it's because of the funding available and the funding mechanisms. So I think there is a broader issue of why AA might be difficult to implement in Somalia, a protracted crisis, because of all these interconnectedness and complexity. So it's not one issue that you need to address. It's peace dividend. You need to, there needs to be political will. If you're not able to access communities, then how do you support them? How do you ensure? So it's a very difficult situation. And I don't want to paint a very bleak picture, but I think it's important for us to really not only necessarily throw money at the problem, but also look at what are actually working, what can we learn? So for me, sometimes the policy, the ideas, the formalization of these approaches come first before the practice. And then, so we talk about localization, and it's an agenda that's been formalized, very theoretical, and then people don't know exactly how do we actually implement it. So maybe the other way around, it's got to be locally driven. It has to be locally driven. It's learning from what works in a specific context. And even within Somalia, it's not the same. Different communities have different problems. Different communities have different ways of coping. So it's supporting the systems, the localized and indigenous systems that are already working, and is scaling that up, and ensuring that we, when I say we, I mean the international community, needs to put the driving seat has to be the local partners, has to be the communities. We've done it for 30 years where it's top down. Maybe it's time for us to change to ensure that we're actually giving people a chance to ensure that we are listening to what they need, looking at the context, and supporting and to have a principled and dignified life.
So I guess it's one part of a much bigger problem where there are a lot of power dynamics, both within the sector and more broadly, and a very complicated political economy. I'm just wondering, given what we've heard, Ed, whether there are any cases where kind of things can work in a wicked crisis, or whether they're always going to be fairly limited in what they can do.
Sure. So, Start Network, we don't have an example of anticipatory action in Somalia during the situation that we're talking about, but there was, I think, a relevant example in 2019, where Start Network members in Somalia, based on their kind of understanding of the kind of indicators for cholera and their understanding of the context and the history, they were confident that the cholera outbreak was on the horizon. They raised an alert to the Start Fund, which was activated. They were kind of thinking in mind about a 2017 outbreak of cholera, which had been quite severe, and they kind of wanted to avert a similar thing happening. So Start Fund there released, it was a kind of small anticipatory action project, so 266,000 British pounds, released to Trocra and Relief International, and they implemented an anticipatory action project to kind of curb the spread of cholera and the impact they would have in 4 locations, and it was very much focused on distribution of wash activities, wash sensitization, that kind of thing, in an attempt to kind of mitigate that spread, particularly focused on IDP camps. And yeah, the Start Network members and the communities that they reached there did kind of attribute the project to preventing the spread, and there not being an outbreak as severe as in 2017, at least in the locations at which they were working. And I think that's a kind of an example where this approach can work on a smaller scale, perhaps in Somalia.
So I guess maybe thinking a bit more smart about scale and thinking about what is a bounded problem or a crisis within a crisis might be a better way to target it. So where does that leave us, I guess, Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cholera example, it's not only because it was small scale that it worked. I think it could have worked also on a larger scale, but it was an example of where there is a clear technical fix that needs doing, and it was based upon local judgment on the ground. It wasn't based upon a bureaucratic trigger. If you'd been waiting for the IPC to reach phase 4, everyone would have been dead of cholera beforehand. But people on the ground were able to use their judgment and tackle a very, very specific problem, and that's what they did. I mean, I'm actually a little bit optimistic in some ways about anticipatory action. I think and I started by comparing it to cash. Cash kind of went off on its own and became almost a sector, and and a sort of the shiny new humanitarian toy, but it was actually a good one. And now it's kind of broken out of that, and cash is no longer, if you like, owned by the humanitarian sector at all, you know, and states and countries have taken it over with things like social protection. And I think we certainly don't need less anticipation. We actually need an awful lot more anticipation. And we need to be looking further ahead. I think the problem is we have to get out of our box. The problem is that we don't have enough. If the Somali pastoralist, the Somali farmer, the small trader, if they don't have opportunities, and what they need is opportunities, you cannot create those on the scale of anticipatory action, even with the slowest onset crisis. It needs much longer time horizon to build those in. Now, what that means is your anticipatory action. So if you have got an anticipatory action water intervention, it cannot sit in an anticipatory action sector. It's got to be part of the water sector. An anticipatory livestock support sits in the livestock sector, not in a generic anticipatory action sector, because then it is part of a long-term strategy. We've got a long-term strategy. What are we going to do about livestock and livestock development in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, wherever? Each country has its strategy, which has got to think about improving productivity, it's got to think about export markets, and it's got to think about, and what do we do when there are recurrent droughts, and what short-term measures do we build in, and what early warning do we build in. So if we can get more anticipation, and that's really what Nexus means. We can't say we're doing the Nexus if we keep ourselves and have our own sector and our own financing mechanisms, because let's face it, having an anticipatory action financing mechanism within the humanitarian sector, it's a great business model for aid agencies. I'm not so convinced it's a great business model for people threatened by crisis in Somalia.
Well, you've heard from our panel. I'd like to open up the floor to discussion. We don't have a mic to bring around, so for those in the room, just raise your hand if you can state your name and affiliation, and then just speak as loudly and clearly as you can. Start here.
Good morning, my name is Mahila Piano. I'm the global producer. Just a comment and a question then, because I'm sure to bring back what I'm sure the classes will be able to do. So we are currently developing or finalizing our strategy for 2023-2026, and one of our main pillars is going to be localization and anticipatory. So that's what I'm saying. I'm just making this as an introduction because I want to learn. I like learn. I mean, I think we're here to learn and to understand how we can put on the business strategy, the public policy we're developing, right? This is one comment. The second one, we're closely working, trying to work closely with other to make more of a joint approach when it comes to analysis and collaboration, so that we're no longer silent. Because we're at the very beginning, bear with us, but can also understand how this can trickle down from a global policy discussion to then field level, when we really have to start working in joint analysis. But my question back to you, as we're really now analyzing the strategies, how would you see the cluster when it comes to anticipatory action? Of course, there are obvious things that we can say. Anticipatory action is important. It's there, is one of our pillars. But I'd like to hear back also from you what you think could also be something that if you were to read our strategy in 2 months' time, say, oh, there is this point, right? Maybe it's in there, but if you have any ideas, let me know. Otherwise, we can to self-bilateral. Thank you.
A few more questions from the floor, and then come back for a round from the panel.
I think that's a really interesting question. I worked in anticipatory action for a few years now, and I feel frustrated by the slowness or reluctance to look at how we build it into cluster systems. Cluster systems are not perfect. I have kept conversation with I don't have my work hat on about everything that's wrong with them, but they are also structures that are in place in all humanitarian crisis. And rather than saying how can they fit into anticipatory action, anticipatory actors should be saying how can we support clusters to be more anticipatory. I think back to one of the findings when you mentioned there that people on the ground in Somalia weren't aware that there was, or they didn't show the good awareness and acceptance that there was going to be another failed or another failed. I mean, that is such a failure of multiple parts of the international system, and that I know that, and that information is not getting down to communities in a way that they can work with it. And so not just like, and that they share an early warning is ready when it's good. So there has been hundreds of millions invested in forecasting and risk analysis for this region, and people who have been impacted by this are not receiving that, or receiving A, receiving it, B, receiving it in a way you can understand it, and C, being given the means to react to it. That is just a catastrophic failure. And I think we need to look at different things that are going on, look outside of the anticipatory action silo, what are processes that need to be influenced to start to address that. For example, area one. But the other thing I think is, so I worked in anticipatory action for years, first with Ed and Start Network, and now with REAP, the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, and we would prefer a conception of it like you described, Donald, where yes, we're talking about the sharp end of the forward crisis, but it needs to go way back. Humanitarian response is needed when either there's a shock that's so big it overwhelms things, or there's a failure or absence of resilience and development investment. So actually, people needing humanitarian response to the last worst case scenario of what's happening. And an anticipatory action approach is, in the humanitarian sense, is the last stand before getting into a response. But to do a good response, or a decent or adequate response, or anticipatory action, many things need to happen way back to scale, all the way going back to development and government staff, things like that. And community within the community can ask what they do. So I think it's really important in anticipatory action as well to find, I think everybody has fears and they're bounded around it not becoming a buzzword, so that everybody sprinkles it into their proposals because donors like it at the moment. But at the same time, and I say this coming from the group of true believers, you cannot have a small group of true believers where it's international organizations where there's a point saying anticipatory action must only believe this, because I see government all the time and they're saying, yeah, we like anticipatory action, they're talking about something that's bigger. Not for us, oh yeah, but that was our suit or 10 million pot, you know, it's, we have to say, how can climate development and other investments be made in the way that supports anticipatory action, mitigates the need for humanitarian response, but also gives us the best chance to keep the point of appropriate humanitarian response. So I hate that I have to phrase all the time that working across silos. I think it's really important for the anticipatory action sector now to look outside of this narrow definition, because even within, you know, something you were mentioning, there's very little we can do sometimes, but then I think cholera in start was really a very good example of what you can do, because those communities get affected by cholera every year. It's very easy to do a basic EPI model that anybody can do using that center. But the thing is, in this case, and I'll shut up in a minute, in the case of Stumble, but I think Somalia is such a good example of the paucity of our own thinking in the international sector around things, and also a lot of issues around climate and economic justice about who has the right to decide what to do and who gets the money. I will stop. But like, okay, even if we did have to, somebody gave us billions tomorrow and said, let's give everybody in Somalia a bit of anticipatory action support for the failed rain, is 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 weeks. Is that a great offer? Is that a great solution for people in Somalia under 6 failed rain? No, it's not. So that's why I really encourage us to keep the plurality or whatever around anticipatory action support, crisis, data forecast, mitigating, but we have to look beyond our 10 to 15 days or whatever, because that really impacts us, especially somewhere like Somalia or Yemen or South Sudan, where, I'm sorry, the line between chronic underdevelopment and humanitarian need is only exists in our head. You go to a pasture like you're a farmer and you go, would you say now you're in a crisis or you're chronically undeveloped? It's going to be like, it's been 6 failed rains. I might have just faced highly likely to be placed by lack of rain or conflict, or some intersection of them. I don't care. Why have you got all the money and I don't have any? So I think that's what I would really encourage us looking at that, because a few days earlier is great, anticipatory is great, but also earlier is better. And I think and again with the anticipatory finance is not brilliant. Let's do it, but also let's look at how free-range finance and free-range actions can do in climate development and resilience, so that we don't actually get to this anticipatory action with them on the cliff edge. response, they've already fallen over. But then I'm trying to think, yeah, there's a big issue here around climate justice and access of government and population to climate finance. You mentioned the climate finance issue there. There is climate finance circling. It's not going to go to the government of Somalia. And that's not always because of institutional issues. Government of Somalia is institutional issues with our own organizations as well. And I think anticipatory action, if we can look at it in an early way and also listen to what communities and governments would like to find as early action, we can rather see it as something that maybe could help us join across these sectors rather than something we're just wedging in and arriving. We come here to help build capacity and anticipate interest because our donor thinks it's sexy and it's often really stuff rather than doing company and people, you know, we can use that as a fulcrum for change rather than going in and wedge it into everything. Sorry, that was quite long.
So yeah, thanks. Leonardo Milano from Workshop and so maybe a couple of questions on the Somalia just maybe to clarify a couple of things. First on the delays, I think the main learning from that pilot came that so there was a delay in disbursement of CERF funding. The main reason being that it's true that already May we had projection, but we had a drought action plan, so we had to readapt. Start thinking that we just make it people first, and that's something that we have to learn and always making sure that the trigger and the action plan are developed and on the findings, I think maybe my question would be, how do you think these findings are generalizable? Because I think so. First of all, let's keep in mind that Somalia, we're talking about $50 million of anticipatory action compared to 3.5, at that time, million people projected to 3 plus 2.6 billion. And I understand that this study was done independently from the people that were supposed to receive anticipatory action, right? So, and of course, especially the outcome letter, this pilot was tiny compared to the scale of the. So I'm wondering if by just selecting random, outlet, by design, the study would have, was supposed to find that nobody, had this, after a month, see, right? Yeah, independent studies from the Center for Inspection, Public University, and the agency, and that are actually showing results. So I think we should be careful in how we generalize, these type of findings and how we make this happen. Just to say, thanks very much for the two-part question. Around first one, because a little bit on the other questions, like how do we get the findings that regarding people actually already hard enough to demonstrate that before that in the second step on a little bit of comments from the question, according to the planning, from the people planning ago, and one of the how the community story actions like this doing international construct starting to draw how do we reform it? So part of our own project. How do we set that around? How do we start with on the ground? What is the that? Well, where the money that's my all we're doing on the final. How do we organize ourselves around that starting rather than
Okay, I'm just going to summarize that because we're having sound issues for those online, and thank you for those who haven't been able to hear that and for your patience. So just briefly, from the food security cluster, who are kind of developing a strategy around anticipatory action, developing a strategy for 23 to 26 with pillars focusing on localization and anticipatory action, a question of how the clusters should fit into this discussion and this model. Some reflections from REAP. First of all, just pointing to the catastrophic information failure of the fact that we sitting in this room knew a drought was coming when the people who actually needed to know didn't, and what that says about the millions that have gone into early warning systems and information systems. But more also talking about making sure that we see anticipatory action from the broadest possible perspective, rather than sort of trying to have purity around what exactly it means to us as a technical group of stakeholders with our own boundaries and our own definitions, and trying to see it that it's not for us to define what this means, we need to look outside this narrow definition, and we need to sort of work across our silos and understand how it sits within broader investments, looking at climate finance and economic justice. Some thoughts from the Center for Humanitarian Data on kind of just acknowledging how that delay happened during the earlier pilots, and making sure that your action plan and your trigger are properly aligned, so that you're not having to revamp your action plan after the trigger has happened. And also a question for the panelists, given that the studies that we've been discussing here are a drop in the ocean of what was actually happening in Somalia, and haven't necessarily covered the direct beneficiaries of some of those anticipatory responses. To what extent are they generalizable, and how cautious do we need to be about that? And then from IFRC, a couple of questions. One about kind of how can we effectively define success in a context where you're preventing problems from having happened, and therefore you don't necessarily have very much to show for it. And then that sort of classic question of who is we, and how can anticipatory action be organized from the perspective of affected people, rather than from kind of where we sit in Geneva. I'm going to turn over to our panelists to see if anyone has any responses from that, and then we'll go back to the floor for a second round of questions, if that's okay.
I think it's so much easier to identify the problems rather than the solutions. So maybe I'll start with how do we build localization into the first question, into the cluster system, and anticipatory action. Yeah, so I think if I heard you correctly, it was from the global to the local, but it should be the other way around. It should be from the local to the global. I think you need to go in with a blank page, even when you're developing your TORs and a concept, and it has to be developed in consultation and with the local partners and the affected communities. What sometimes we do is that we come with a concept in the way that we understand it, and then we try and validate it when we go into the field on the concept that we went with. So I think there has to be a complete open-mindedness in what you want to achieve and how, and then we also need to be realistic, because sometimes we make these grand gestures which are difficult to implement. So we need to be realistic when we're defining concepts and localizing that concept into the targeted countries. Okay, so go in with an open mind, go with a blank page. The discussion has to start from the ground onwards. With the cluster systems, even in the regional ones, or the what are they called, area-based clusters or area-based coordination, it's local partners are participants. They don't necessarily take the leadership. So I think having local partners being in the lead and supporting them to take the role of being leads, because if you're implementing a program and you're running around ensuring that you're doing the operational side of it, it's very difficult then for you to have time. So a lot of them are multi-hatted. They're doing the coordination, and they're doing the programmatic delivery There's always tight deadlines. So I think there has to be a capacity support to those local partners. It's difficult to say, here we are, we need your input from the go, but then you don't have the time or the dedicated staff. So ensuring that there is dedicated capacity to ensure that people do have time in formulating their thinking, in collecting the ideas, I think that's also really important. So supporting the local actors or the local part of the coordination system, cluster system, to be able to lead the process. I think that's also very important if we want to genuinely develop the concept and the strategy based on the need of those communities. I mean, I understand the difficulties of doing, if you're thinking at the global level, then you will try and have a system which sort of try and fit in the different contexts. But I think it's really important to understand what can work well in a particular context, rather than try and fit the context into this global concept that you're doing. I mean, it's challenging. Definitely it's not easy, but I think it's important to do things differently. It's important to challenge ourselves, and it's important to ensure that when we say we want to give the leadership to the local partners, then we generally do that as well, but support them in doing so as well. Was there another question for me? Yeah, I'll give somebody else a chance.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I'll take on the OCHA question, which I think was directly aimed at myself. I think that I definitely agree with you that they were, small projects and pilots, especially the 2020 OCHA response was a pilot study, not pilot study, pilot project in Somalia. And yes, it was not in response to a drought. It was actually, I think, the compounding impact of the locust infestation, the COVID-19, as well as flooding. But there were, there was projections of, I think 22% of the population was projected to be in IPC, level 3 by July to September of 2020. So that was why it was triggered in May 2020, and the funds were disbursed in July of that same year. So I think my point is not necessarily to do with, it was to do with the timeliness aspect of the SURF model, and the reason why local actors, who are often always the first responders to crises, do not receive the funding in a timely manner, and therefore cannot, in an anticipatory way, respond to the crisis. And I think it's more so to do with how the SURF model does not allow for a quick and efficient transfer of money or funds to local actors, for them to be able to carry out these projects. Oftentimes, local actors are forced to pre-finance their own projects, and therefore then may end up receiving the funds way later. So I think it was more so to do with, I think, more the timeliness aspect, which I think can be said of a lot of different projects in the humanitarian sector. And I don't think it's anything unique to OCHA's SURF model, but I do think that when we're trying to account for why some of the anticipatory action responses to the drought were not as successful as they could have potentially been, I think timeliness is something that we can point to, and I think that the SURF model and that is I think a valid critique of the SURF model. But yeah.
I can speak to a couple of these. I think as the REAP colleague was alluding to, the definitions and the policing of the boundaries of anticipatory action is quite a contested area. Speaking from an agency that has even anticipatory action, which some would consider is on the boundary of what they would consider anticipatory action, and having to advocate for that. So yeah, I think it's absolutely the case that taking a risk-informed approach with opportunities for early action across and back into the past is absolutely something we should all be advocating for. And whether or not we call it anticipatory action is semantics, because it's just something which should be happening. There should be opportunities for everyone to see, all the practitioners and communities to see themselves having a role within that anticipatory action perspective. And it's, I think, upon anticipatory action practitioners to be able to say that. You know, whether it, you know, using that risk information, the early warnings, the models we have to make use for everyone. So, you know, development actors could be doing crisis modifiers based on warnings that they have ahead of kind of the period that might be anticipatory. And I guess, I mean, this personal view, I think there's a logical conclusion of anticipatory action, which moves towards a view of vulnerability reduction as the most important part of the work that any of us can be doing. That, you know, when you have a risk model or you have an anticipatory action system that is properly impact-based, the needs are always going to be exacerbated and higher according to how vulnerable people are in that community. And ultimately, it's I would hope we could reach a point where we could advocate for actually reducing the premiums of anticipatory action systems by going back and saying, oh, if we reduce the vulnerability of this community in the first place, then we're going to have to pay less humanitarian later on. Speaking to the question from IFRC, which I'm just reminding myself of, yeah, how do we make anticipatory action owned by local communities? I think there's a couple of things here. First is that, you know, we had a colleague from a Start Network member yesterday speak at the Anticipation Hub launch of the Anticipation report, and he talked about how his local agency had been brought into the contingency planning for anticipatory action, and that was the first time that happened. And I think there's even less of a excuse for not properly bringing in local actors and the communities that they serve into anticipatory action. When you're arranging everything in advance and you're doing all that pre-arranging, then yeah, there's less room for the excuses for not doing that. So I hope that anticipatory action kind of creates that space and therefore should be being used like that. And yeah, that yeah, community-based anticipation is I think a really promising area that we should be kind of expanding into as well.
I mean, first to clear up the point about our actual research, I apologize if I gave the impression that we had made a conclusion from the fact that none of our informants were recipients and therefore anticipatory action wasn't at scale and had no impact. Sorry, I apologize. That was not the that wasn't the meaning I was trying to give at all. We were really happy. We did not want to find people who were the beneficiaries of anticipatory action, precisely because we didn't want to look at the impact of aid. We wanted to try and understand what constraints do people face going through a crisis, and then in retrospect say, what could we have unblocked so that we know for next time. And no, I mean, if you look at the population of the country and you pick 100 families at random, of course you weren't going to find anyone. So that yeah, there's no conclusions being drawn from the fact that we didn't have beneficiaries. As I say, that's what we wanted to was to get not to get beneficiaries. I want to actually link up the first and the last comment question. One was, what's the role of clusters in anticipatory action? That was the first one. And the last one, I think, was, how do we stop making us the starting point, and how do we make people threatened by or affected by crisis the starting point? And I want to bring those two together because I think the answer to the first lies in the second. Ed, if you don't mind, I'm going to slightly quibble with the phrase that you used, broadly agreeing. You said we need to bring people in. Yeah, and there's no excuse for not bringing people in. I say, no, let's not bring people in. We need to go out. If we bring people in, we're still, if you like, the starting point, and we're in control. So what's the role of the cluster? The role of a global cluster cannot be to say, here's the menu, here's the recipe, do that in the event of IPC being X or the weather forecast being X. The plan's got to come at country level. The plan will very rarely be national. It's because countries have got so much variability within them. And surely the role of the cluster is to help its members have the skills to be able to go around knocking on doors whether it's the Ministry of Agriculture, whether it's the resilience program from local government or an NGO or a local, it doesn't matter what, and saying, hi guys, this is my skill set around crisis. We know that you're likely to have a crisis in the next few years because you have them every few years. How can I help you so that you can be quicker next time? What skills do I have as an anticipatory action expert? I don't mean me, I mean one who is. What skills do I have that I can share with you so that you can work better next time? So in a sense, we don't own a response because very often our work should not be about us delivering a solution. Our work has very often got to be to support people to be able to do their own solutions, which of course absolutely does not mean that there is never a role when everyone gets swamped for humanitarian agencies coming in and delivering as well. So of course, I'm not saying that should not exist, but that's got to be the last resort. I think that's enough.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and I know there were some other hands in the audience, so let's go for a second round.
I wanted to ask you, what do the insurances do? And then also, I asked, what is the, is there a limit that is defined institutionally, separating anticipatory humanitarian action from anticipatory development? Or is this definition happening just de facto by the funding that comes through the decision, funding and labeling of that? There was one thing that you said, and I forgot.
Yes, at the back.
So yeah, my name is Paul Harvey. My first job was in Somalia in 1994, so I'm guessing the sort of people in the room who weren't born when humanitarian aid started in Somalia. So it's worth just reminding yourself that it was 30 or more years of continuous humanitarian action in Somalia. So it's a very long-term endeavour. And the next sort of, I think, overly optimistic about likely funding patterns. There's unlikely to be significantly more money for Somalia over the next few years. So the question to the panel is, what would you do less of in humanitarian aid to enable more anticipatory action there? Because I think it probably is a trade-off in terms of the price of activities and price for funding space.
My name is I'm working for and first a few comments. I appreciate your question. Anticipatory action, anticipatory humanitarian action, the second comment is, I really listen to this point. It's very important. Good. Because we have not anticipatory. Anticipatory can start with understanding risk and consequences. And that means to go out to people and talk about it.
Sorry, yeah.
So thank you very much. I'm saying that I'm a advisor in the team. I got some useful and beautiful answers to what was asked. So what we see sometimes is from financial perspective, development and humanitarian are considered good. When one goes up, the other one goes up, right? So, and this is important to the reality what we face where the budget everywhere, so donors have the budget for not the same. So how do we deal with the risk that we can spend more money on action? So somehow we can use this money somewhere else for something else, right? And I understand the point that more money is spent on this direction today, less we spend in the future for the same response. However, unfortunately, it's not linear, it's free. So my point. So we spend more money on action today, so we have less money for something else. So I don't have an answer to this question. I will be interested to hear your opinion, how to deal with it, how to change the approach to humanitarian assistance as an investment, as we don't have the development right now. And yeah, what can be the solution there? Right.
I'm just going to summarize those questions for those online, and we also have one question from the internet. So a couple of big questions from humanitarian outcomes and NRC around trade-offs and the idea that, first of all, potentially inevitably, if you're going to spend more money on anticipatory action, given the limited amount of financing available, you necessarily have to spend less money on something else. Coupled with the idea that anticipatory action is meant to be an investment and that it is meant to reduce costs later on, but that process is often not linear and so is quite hard, I guess, to prove. So kind of how do you deal with that particular set of trade-offs and how do you make that case? Also some comments from Weltongehilfe on the need to be more precise on terminology and making sure that we know what we're talking about and that preparedness and anticipatory action are not the same thing. And that anticipatory action from their perspective needs to be about understanding risk and quantifying risk. We also had a question about funding in terms of whether there's an institutionally defined limit between humanitarian and development approaches to anticipatory action, or is this just a de facto distinction in terms of what funding streams are available for what? I'm also just going to read a question from the floor, and that's from the internet, and then we'll go back to the panelists. This is from DRC asking, are there any prospects of integrating predictions of violence into triggering indicators? So to start building anticipatory action around conflicts as well, especially if we're thinking in terms of climate change-induced conflict. We'll go back to the panel and see if you have any thoughts on any of that.
I think I'll try and reflect on the financing mechanisms, development humanitarian, and also about the state of funding itself to humanitarian for humanitarian purposes, especially in a protracted crisis. And then how do you prioritize that? So just thinking on my feet here, and maybe thinking out loud, the humanitarian financing kind of looks at crises that hit a community. So community that was stable and functioning, then you have crises like floods, so you have crises such as earthquake, and then you go in, you save lives, then you leave, and people go back to normality. For protracted crisis like Somalia, that's not the case. It's been slow, it's been ongoing, dimensions change. Before people can recover, you call it, now we're in developmental stage, you have another crisis hitting. So this model that with this short-term financing mechanisms to crises like Somalia isn't working. So there is the need to think differently when it comes to protracted crisis than crisis that hit, like I said, the earthquake maybe. So for long-term crisis, like in Somalia now, the response, I'm sure there's not much change since '94. Sorry, I think the date a colleague that I mentioned. It just got complex. It just changed. Yet there's continual, the response remains the same. Drought hits and we're tracking water. How long could we respond by tracking water? It's literally about water management. You either have lack of it or you have too much of it in particular areas. So, or we're transferring cash to communities to be able to cope. Excellent. It's good when it comes to addressing the situation and saving lives. But then dependency on cash transfers, it's expensive for so long when you're in an IDP camp. It's expensive and it's not lifting people out of their vulnerabilities in the situation. So there has to be a different way of funding and thinking in supporting communities in Somalia, for example, who have been in the same recurrent situation. Investment, this siloed way of funding development humanitarian people need to be given opportunities to be able to lift themselves out of poverty, input into the economy, investment, long-term investment, job creation, alternative livelihoods. It seems to, I mean, like what you said before, it's a system where we're definitely trying to support and save lives, but also being part of the problem as well. Because if you're an IDP camp and all you know is receiving this handout, then maybe you're just waiting for this handout. When crisis hits, I mean, there's a joke in Somalia where people say, when something happens, you go people on media saying, we need the community, we need the Western community to come and support us, rather than looking at what can we do for ourselves, how can we get together? So that dependency and always looking outside of of getting these handouts is actually, and the Somali community historically would come together, whether it's through the clan system or through communities and villages to try and address. And I think that is coming back in certain areas, because there is an example where the community got together and put defenses against the potential flooding. So I think that type of thing needs to be encouraged, but there needs to be investment in the right time at the right places to ensure that we're not sustaining this recurrent situation for communities, but trying to provide them. I don't know how that will be done. I mean, it's politics, it's what donor governments are interested in investing in their money, but something needs to change. Thank you.
We move this way through. Might be easier. I'll be very quick this time. I'm not always very brief, I will be. We missed one. There was one point brought up before from the first round, actually, just to very quickly touch on how can we define success and the idea that it's impossible. I don't think it is impossible, actually. I think we're just not doing it right. It's not, I'm not too worried about kind of how we define success. If we can understand how people use support which they get and what they would have done otherwise, and what people did who didn't get support, then you can start to see what difference you made. And the problem is most of our learning, and this is both our monitoring and our evaluation, starts by trying to make sure that we learn nothing whatsoever about context. We strip context right out of what we look at. We only look at, for example, at beneficiaries, inverted commas. We don't look at what everybody else was doing. If we're doing randomized controlled trials, they are designed specifically to make sure that the context can't intrude and contaminate our data, so that we're learning about the very things we don't want to learn about, which is our assumption, which is we assume our assumptions are true and then try and learn, instead of assuming all of our assumptions might not be true and trying to learn about them. So I think it is possible. We've just got to change how we think about monitoring and how we think about learning. Oh, check it off. Adding conflict to anticipatory reaction. Predicting conflict is going to be really, really hard, but the idea that the conflict, which is part of the context, should be built into your scenarios, definitely. And as we're doing more anticipatory reaction, let's not do more anticipatory reaction. Let's have more forward-looking decision-making in everything that we do.
I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible. I really like the question back where you asked about, whether we should, programs we should stop funding, I guess, in order to fund other programs. I'm not sure if I buy into that binary, just because I think that we need to change the way we think about the system itself, right? And I think that a lot of times, for example, the drought, which is the one I did the research on, there's a very linear perspective in the way we understand droughts. There's the before, there's the during, and then there's the after. But for the local people on the ground, that's not how they see or they experience these droughts or these shocks. And I think that what we need to understand is that for people who are currently experiencing the drought, their experience of this current drought is also influenced and impacted by their experience with the previous drought and any future droughts in the future. So I think, I'm not sure if I think that the answer lies in taking funding from one place and put it into another, but more so thinking about how we understand the system and sort of the typologies that come out of the system.
Just before the internet disappears, because the question came from the internet on conflict. There is Anticipation and Conflict Working Group from the Anticipation Hub. You can be part of that. OCHA put out a report last year, which is about the feasibility of modelling for conflict and anticipatory action. Had some really interesting conclusions. Mainly, it is very difficult, as Simon said. Start Network with the Start Fund and that flexible approach that I mentioned, we do have examples where there's been anticipatory action around conflict. It's always been reasonably curtailed and focused specifically on normally like on key dates that are already known, elections upcoming, announcements of forthcoming violence. But there are examples, and we at Start have a report coming out in next few weeks on feasibility of using at the Start Fund around conflict and how to expand that, and hopefully complementary to what OCHA put out. And I should plug, Start Network have a forewarned community on conflicts. We've got an upcoming session at the start of May. So if you want to join that and hear what we have to say and what some of our partners have to say about anticipation and conflicts, then Google Start Network forewarn and follow the instructions. Yeah, like the code there.
All right, I think we're going to have to leave it there, as I think that's time on the meeting. Thanks very, very much for all of your contributions to the floor and for coming to listen, and huge thanks to all of our panelists.